Hello, everybody. You are listening to Through Time and Clades. We're back.
Woohoo!
Yay. As always, I'm Albert.
And I'm Joan.
And today we're going to bring you our monthly nature news episode, just looking at some cool studies that we noticed over the past month. And those are always nice and fun to talk about, I think. So, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well. Vacation has been fantastic. For those of you who remember from our last episode, I'm currently, at the time of recording, in Florida,
Mm.
visiting family on my mother's side, and spent a couple of weeks there, just taking in the environment and just catching up with people. And it's been really nice. I've had wonderful opportunities to go to a number of different natural history esque um, facilities and locations here in Florida. I did Zoo Tampa,
Mm.
which I haven't done since I was very little, and that was just a beautiful zoo um, that features a lot of different animals from around the world, all in these different little sections that you can go to, and you're like immersed into the wildlife of those different regions, and they have a nice selection of creatures.
Mm.
Um, of course, they have the Asian exhibit with babirusa and Indian rhinos and Malayan tapirs, um, various pheasants from East Asia. Of course, they have a nice Florida Everglades section, which is
Mm.
really nice. Alligators and manatees, and the
Mm.
manatees are especially nice because they came so close to the glass. I never been so close to a manatee
Mm.
before, and just to kind of see them there, and just munching on lettuce because
Mm.
that's pretty much what they do all day. They're all rescues,
Mm.
so you can see the boat scratches and that kind of thing, which is always sad.
Yeah.
But they're being well cared for, and they seem to enjoy like their kind of little pool that they share with pelicans,
Yeah.
which are also very fun.
That's cool.
Yeah, and there was a beautiful primates exhibit, which I definitely paid attention to. Learned a couple things about primate care that I didn't know
Mm.
about. Apparently, in some zoos, like they'll put chickens with their primates, and they're there to eat bugs that might cause diseases if they were to bite any of these animals.
Right. That is
So
interesting.
yeah, I had never seen that before, and it was
Mm.
kind of cool. They were silkies, so they were
Mm.
extra fluffy.
Right.
Um, but it was awesome. Beautiful orangutan exhibit. There were some siamangs that had just had an infant, and me and my sister got like front row seats to see them cuddling with their newborn.
Oh.
Um, it was adorable, absolutely adorable. Yeah, and then of course there was an African section, which was really nice. They had all kinds of like African tortoises and um, the familiar megafauna that everybody knows.
Right.
But during that time of the day, it was already like high noon, and it was really hot. So all of them were in the shade and just
Yeah.
kind of resting. So we had kind of learned that if you go to a zoo very early, a lot of the animals are very active, and that's when you want to, go and experience that. So we had already been there for a couple hours, um, and it really pays off. Like in the Asian exhibit, they had Sumatran tigers,
Mm.
and they had one that was just walking around its enclosure and kind of doing a morning jog. And my sister owns a cat, so she could tell the behavior, like, oh, it's hungry.
Right. Right.
It would like walk around and like growl really loud. And like look around crevices for things, so we could tell it's like feed me,
Right.
which was super fun. Bit of a Jungle Book moment too,
Mm.
because there were some black vultures that were sitting in the enclosure just watching this tiger, and kind of made me chuckle a bit. The black vultures, oh my gosh! So the zoo encourages native birds to go and nest there, and so we've seen all kinds of like egrets and ibises like really close in the trees where their babies are there peeping, and
Mm.
you get really good looks of them, and that was really sweet. There were just so many black vultures, and I don't know what it is. I presume it has to do with just the food that they feed the
Yeah.
animals. Vultures are like, oh, free snacks, awesome.
Right.
Um,
Right.
but there were just so many to the point where they actually had like signs in the streets basically saying, hey, watch your heads because these animals will poop on you. Just be careful. They're not ours, so we're not liable if you get pooped
Mm.
on. you know? um, oh, it was so funny because there was one enclosure with a striped skunk. It was
Yeah.
a fairly big one. They give these animals lots of space here. But we couldn't find any skunk, but there were certainly like 40 vultures in there just hanging out. So that was just kind of a
Right.
laugh. And same with the American black bear too. the two of them were just sitting in a rock in the corner of their pen, getting pecked at by one vulture, while like 10 others were there sunning themselves, and they all looked like a cult because they were out there with their wings out,
Mm-hmm.
just sunning themselves, like all in the same row, same position. Um, that was hilarious. So that was a fun zoo. Zoo Tampa. For those of you who might know, this used to be the Lowry Park Zoo, but I think they
Yes.
switched names under new ownership because there's a Zoo Miami that I'm familiar with because our childhood zoo, the Virginia Zoo, uh, the African elephants that used to be housed there are now in Zoo Miami,
Mm-hmm.
following a push to better elephant care, where it's
Mm-hmm.
like if you have less than 3 elephants, you either need to get more or move them to a new facility.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what they did. And now they get to enjoy 24-hour sunlight and this huge pool and other elephants to hang out with. And I haven't kept up with them a lot, but I'd like to think that they're doing a lot better.
Yeah.
The elephant enclosure at the Virginia Zoo was not bad, but one of the elephants had died of cancer, so it was
Mm-hmm.
just kind of two that were all alone.
Right.
They needed friends to hang out with.
Mm.
So I think that worked out really well. So there was that. And then there was the Florida Museum of Natural History in Gainesville, which was lovely. Apparently, according to the website, it's one of the top 5 natural history museums in the country, which is saying something because there's quite a lot of them.
Right.
And I guess it's a question of like, how do you rate a natural history museum? But I can certainly say like whatever or whoever came up with these ratings, it was very well justified because it was not like a large museum. Like this is not like New York in
Mm-hmm.
the AMH, which is so big you need like a couple of days to go through everything.
Yeah.
So you can get through this all in about 3 or 4 hours maybe
Mm-hmm.
of your. But they just put so much in there, and the exhibits were really well laid out. It's all centered around Florida natural history. So there's a fossil hall that begins after the KPG extinction, because I guess Florida doesn't really have a lot of dinosaurs because the whole state was underwater during the time, so not really a lot of real estate for them. So it begins with like marine organisms in the Cenozoic, giant sea snakes and early manatees and proto whales, that sort of thing. And then as land starts to emerge in that region, we start to see like oreodonts and entelodonts and all manner of Cenozoic mammals, as well as giant birds, terror birds, and crocodiles, and all sorts of amazing creatures. And then it goes to the ice ages, and there's a beautiful ground sloth that is like 10 or 11 feet tall, standing, and you can stand under it, and it's really cool. Um, really well done. And then there's a Native American exhibit where they look at the southern Florida cultures, most specifically the Calusa,
Mm-hmm.
who I've talked about a little bit in my series Humanity: A Prologue. They are foragers, but they've essentially built their own state using marine surplus resources, and they had these huge mounds that were made out of seashells that the higher ups would live in, as well as other communities, and fascinating culture. All the aspects of it are covered in that display,
Mm-hmm.
and they're linked to the greater ecosystems of Florida too. So it kind of like has a nice segue from the natural environments to the human habitats, and it's really well done. Beautiful scale models and archaeological remains. Um, and so just yeah, I've been really enjoying myself, and the facilities that I've been to are just wonderful, and I
Mm-hmm.
highly recommend them if you happen to be in the Florida area. I mean, I know like the joke is it's Florida, Florida's kind of an odd place, but there's some there's some diamonds here and there.
Oh
But
yeah.
yeah, that's I mean that's just a little bit of what I've done. But what about you, my friend?
Oh, me. Well, mostly, I've mostly been busy with my PhD research. Yeah, still working on that. Um, I have, been busy doing a lot of data collection. That phase is pretty much done, more or less. So soon I'll have to do like actually analyzing the data and writing it up, and that's gonna take a whole lot of work. But yeah, it's good to get to that point. Um, and yeah, other than that, I'm not sure there's anything too major I have to report on the show, because yeah, that's that's really what's been taking up most of my time. Um, but yeah, it's good to take a break and think about some other things that aren't necessarily directly related to my thesis, even though they are topically somewhat related. Um,
Hmm.
but yeah, I'm glad you're having a great time in Florida. It certainly despite the jokes, is an amazing place for natural history enthusiasts for many reasons. Um, yeah, I've only had the good fortune to visit just once, and that was when I was very young. I was pretty much just a toddler at the time, and so I don't remember a whole lot. But I do remember going to Zoo Tampa, but before it was called that, um, and I have a few fuzzy memories of things I saw there. So yes, I do remember the manatees in particular, um, and also their Florida panther. That was pretty cool. But yeah, I would love to revisit again as an adult, like now, for sure.
Oh yeah. And like I know like there's a lot more zoos where that came from here.
Mhm,
Whether we'll be able to go visit them during this trip, I'm not too sure.
mhm.
But yeah, like I know there's yeah, Zoo Miami. There's of course the Animal Kingdom technically counts, Disney World,
Right.
which I've had the fortune to go see, and that's a contrary to what you might think. Like their main goal is conservation there,
Mhm.
so don't go in there thinking that it's like an amusement park first and a zoo second. No,
Right.
like they keep their animals as far away from any attractions as possible, and they give them like the top quality care. Um, so that was very pleasing to find out.
That's good. Yeah.
But yeah, totally. And then of course like the national parks. I mean, the Everglades. One of these days, I'm gonna go to the Everglades. I don't know if it's gonna be this trip, but it'll be someday for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah. It's pretty much a must see, I would say.
And
um,
go on one of those propeller boats through the
hmm.
swamps, like I see on TV all the time.
Right. Right. Yeah, that would be cool. That would be cool. Definitely on my bucket list too.
Yeah.
Alrighty. But yeah, I guess if we don't have much more personal stuff to go over, I guess we could start the episode proper. Now, before we actually get into news, however, we do have a few shout outs we wanted to mention, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, okay. So let's go to the next slide. And first of all, our friend Katrina Van Grau has started a crowdfunding campaign so that she can start a PhD. And if you're not familiar with her work, well, she has authored and illustrated two really amazing books. Um, the Unfeathered Bird, which is about basically bird skeletons and other aspects of their soft tissue anatomy other than the feathers. Um, and also Unnatural Selection, which is about how animals have been modified through artificial selection by humans, um, and making a case for the importance of studying these domesticated animals in evolutionary biology. Um, and they are both really, really great books. Um,
Hmm.
yeah, so if you haven't seen them yet, you should definitely check them out if you get the chance. Um, and something that's especially amazing about Katrina's work is that she has pretty much like no formal education in like evolutionary biology or any of these subjects you might expect um, her to have gone through in terms of formal training. No, it's like this is all self-taught, and she is extremely knowledgeable about these subjects despite that. And I would say like in some ways you know, because of her unique background, she has a lot of insights on these topics that um, might not be immediately um, obvious to people who are within the field. I think she brings a great sort of outsider's perspective to these subjects that we would do very well to pay attention to. Um, However, it has always been, a lifelong dream of hers to actually start a PhD and to actually do a PhD, like studying these topics at a more, academic kind of context. Um, And finally, she has gotten the chance to do so. So, University of Cambridge has given her an offer. Um, Now, the main thing that is that still kind of stands in her way right now is that she has to produce um, basically evidence that she can pay for the tuition fees, and the opportunities for funding mature students like herself are relatively limited. So she has started a crowdfunding campaign to kind of you know raise enough money to do so. And so yeah, you know, if you enjoy Katrina's work, please, 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 you know, consider contributing. And even if you can't directly contribute, you can still spread the word around. We will definitely leave a link to this GoFundMe in the description. And if you're not familiar with their work, you should check it out because, yeah, everything on this slide, so including that image of Archaeopteryx and also the covers of her books, they were all illustrated by her. So yeah, you can just from this small sample, you can see how amazing of an artist she is.
Yeah, beautiful stuff. I can definitely confirm. I'm fortunate to own Unnatural Selection
Mm,
at least, and it's just a wonderful book. I know we talked about it a little bit in my series, Humanity: A Prologue,
that's
but
right.
just to kind of reaffirm what we were talking about, um, the range of examples of artificial selection that she uses, ranging from pigeons to cats to sheep and goats, is excellent, and the lessons on each chapter, which go through various aspects of artificial selection, like plasticity um, and genetics, are they're not overcomplicated. Her writing style makes for easy understanding of these topics and
Mm-hmm.
opens the door to curiosity on artificial selection.
Yes,
So yeah, I can definitely back that up for sure. Katrina Van Grauw is just an amazing artist and author, and I'd love to see her continue her passions.
mm-hmm.
Is always important. Um, so at the moment on her GoFundMe, we are at 5,564 pounds, and we need 16,000 total to make this work. So just as kind of a state of the situation,
Right. Mm.
and she is asking for the full amount by the end of July in order to kind of confirm her place
Right. Mm.
on the PhD program. So we can make that. Oh, like it would set her up, and we'd be able to see what other fascinating things she has to share with us.
Absolutely. Yeah, we would be very fortunate to have her in the field of avian evolutionary biology. I can definitely confirm that much. Um, And yeah, in addition, she is going to be working on the second edition of the Unfeathered Bird while she is working on the PhD. So I think those two projects would go very nicely together, hand in hand, and it would be amazing to see what emerges from the other side.
Absolutely, yeah. So again, like if you can donate, definitely do so. If not, like spreading the word is always important.
Hmm.
That's why we're trying to do our part here to get it out to as wide an audience as possible.
Absolutely. So, yep, there we go. Do we want to go to the next one?
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool.
So this next shout out, this is our friend Henry Thomas,
Who
who
gets a shout out in every episode, actually.
that's right, because he composed the wonderful theme music
Hmm.
for our series. Just a very good friend of ours, well versed in paleontology, great artist. Has been working on a project called On Beyond Holocene, which is basically a look at a potential future of the evolution of life on Earth following the Holocene epoch, and like what would happen if humans had died out and then other animals had carried on natural selection as they had for millions of years in the past, um, which is a very fun topic in the world of biology, speculative zoology as it's called.
Mm-hmm.
Some of you may be familiar with like Dougal Dixon's After Man or the Animal Planet show The Future is Wild, which have also explored these topics in their own unique ways, and very fascinating stuff. But Henry has a blog, Those with Pycnofibers, Pycnofibers being the filamentous covering that pterosaurs had,
That's right.
which may or may not be related to feathers.
Yeah.
Kind of a discourse there.
It's complicated.
Um, right. Definitely don't have time to get into that. But he has written a really wonderful post called "How to Start an Ice Age,"
Hmm.
and it basically goes into the geologic and climatological factors that lead to ice ages in the first place. So it's not so much a blog post about the various ice ages of the Earth's past, of which there were quite a number of them,
Hmm.
but more like how these events happen in the first place. And it's very well detailed and very well sourced. Um, and it kind of goes into like each of these different ice ages and like how each of them emerged in the Earth's geologic past and what made them different
Hmm.
from each other and what made them alike. And so we just thought this was a very fascinating post, and we care about our friends, and we wanted to kind of put this out there for more people to read. It's a very great introduction into sort of ice age science, and gives you just a little bit of a taste of what we know about these cooler periods of the Earth's past, which were very cool.
Yeah, I completely agree. I also read that post, of course, and yeah, I agree with everything you said. It's a really clear introduction to the concept of ice ages and how they start and their how they the various phenomena that occur during them are characteristic of ice ages. And I think ice ages are periods in Earth history that I think a lot of people are fascinated by, even if they're not like super into Earth history or paleontology. They're definitely a very well known in the public consciousness, but there are a lot of misconceptions about ice ages, and I think this post is a great place to start with to actually learn more about what we actually know about ice ages. Of course, one of the biggest misconceptions that I can think of is that, there is one ice age, the ice age. But
Yeah,
really, when people say that, they're referring to the most recent ice age, the Pleistocene ice age, which technically is still going on. It's just that we are in an interglacial phase of that ice age. But even more than that, there have been several other ice age events in Earth history, and yeah, I think this post does a really good job of kind of introducing all those concepts for sure and more.
definitely. So, as with before, we will link to this blog post in the description, as well as on Beyond Holocene,
Mhm.
because Henry has made that now available to the public, and he's doing all the coding by hand, by the way,
Wow.
like old school, like internet building, which is
Right.
mad props. I remember learning that in digital design in high school. That was, whew,
Yeah.
that was kind of a doozy. So props. But he's already added a lot of cool information, some wonderful illustrations of different animals that he's come up with. So
Mhm.
we'll be sure to share that with you as well.
Yeah.
Definitely go check out his Ice Age post because it is really nice.
All right. Should we get into the news stories now then?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. Let's see. Okay, so one of my stories is up first. Um, my first story, as usual, each of us will cover two stories in this episode. And so my first story is about elephant seals. Um, and I'm sure, like, pretty much everyone who has even a passing interest in zoology has some idea of what elephant seals are like. They are very popular subjects for sure in popular books and documentaries. Um, and most of the time, probably the most commonly depicted uh, behavior of elephant seals is the males fighting on beaches. Males
Mhm.
are massive. I mean, they are the largest carnivorans in the world. So carnivora is the group of carnivorous mammals that includes cats and dogs and bears, and of course also seals and many others. And yeah, elephant seals are the largest carnivorans in the world, and that is specific to the males, which are absolutely gargantuan beasts. And you know, when they breed, elephant seals congregate on beaches, and the males kind of defend harems of females that they mate with from other males. And during these kind of territorial disputes, the males can get very battered and bloody as they kind of throw themselves literally against each other and bite each other. And it's yeah, it's not a pretty sight. Um, and in general, male elephant seals look, kind of grotesque. Like their noses are really big, which hence the name elephant seal, and they can make these deep kind of bellows by blowing through their noses, um, and they have these huge canine teeth, like most other carnivorans, but especially uh, useful here for fighting each other with. Um, so yeah, they are certainly a sight to behold, you could say. um, Whereas the female elephant seals, as pictured on here with a female elephant seal with her baby, are much smaller than the males. The sexual dimorphism in size is extremely apparent in this species, um, and they also congregate on the beaches to breed. So they stay on the beaches um, during the period when they are feeding their young with milk, naturally, being mammals. But eventually, after the young are old enough, the females leave them behind and return to the ocean. And so, elephant seals, even though in documentaries and books you tend to see them pictured or illustrated during their breeding season on the beach, for most of the year they actually spend their lives out in the ocean. And that's where they look for food and, you know, build up their fat reserves until the next time they have to come up onto the beach to breed, because they don't feed at all while they're in this breeding period. So yeah, that's it's definitely very important for them to get enough food out there during the rest of the year. And the new study that we're going to talk about today tells us quite a few new things about foraging behavior in elephant seals and in female elephant seals specifically, which don't tend to get as much attention in documentaries or books or other popular resources. So that's pretty cool. Um, and yeah, like I said, elephant seals actually spend most of the year in the ocean, and they are actually really superb ocean predators out there. Like you see them on land, like just hanging around, lounging around, or and getting bloodied in the case of the males, fighting each
Mm.
other, and they look really clumsy and yeah, they they look really out of place. But out in the ocean, they are extremely well adapted predators. Um, they are some of the deepest diving mammals in the world. Female elephant seals, in particular, can dive to depths of around 1,500 meters below the surface. Um, and not only that, but they stay down there for a very long time. They stay down there for over an hour in some cases. So, yeah, they are incredible marine predators. Now, yeah, this actually reminds me that when I was little, I had a book about Australian mammals, and it was a pretty interesting, popular book about Australian mammals. It was written by an Australian zoologist, and the thing was that it wrote about many different species of Australian mammals, but it did so in verse, in poetry, basically. So there were these poems about all these different types of Australian mammals, and one of the poems was about elephant seals. And yeah, there are elephant seals in Australia. These are the southern elephant seals, um, and uh, the poem was really interesting, or at least it left a big impression on me because basically for most of the poem it talks about how the elephant seal looks absolutely ridiculous on land, like it's clearly not meant for walking, like all it does on land is like fight each other until they're battered and bruised and they look ridiculous, etc., etc. And then at the end it finally closes out with how, but in the water, in the ocean, that's when it's where it's really in its element, and it is an incredibly graceful kind of swimmer, um, and it's it's really a sight to behold. And it kind of ends with a verse that goes something like, let me think, uh, let's all be assessed by the things we do best, and not those we can only just do. So,
Hmm.
yeah. So
I
kind of,
like
kind of,
that.
yeah. There's a bit of applicability there, I think, to our human lives too. So yeah, I always thought that that poem was really cool. So it's definitely stuck with me. Um, but yeah, so obviously out in the ocean, however, it's much harder for us to observe these seals, especially considering how deep they dive and how long they stay down there. So we don't know too much about their biology when they're for most of their lives when they're spending out at sea. Um, and this new study kind of gives us some really cool information about that subject. Yeah, I would, I would actually love to see like a documentary looking at seals and maybe also other animals too, like say penguins, like what they're doing out in the ocean when they're not breeding, because you always see these animals depicted in documentaries when they're breeding on land, but you hardly ever see them like being filmed when they're out foraging and in the ocean, which is actually where they spend most of their time. Um, and I get why, because it's logistically very, very difficult. But of course, nature documentaries these days, the high budget ones especially, are you know famed for being groundbreaking in terms of like filmmaking methods and all that. So I'm sure smart people can figure that out and give us. I think they could give us a really cool documentary focusing on that subject. Um,
Yeah, I think I mean, I wonder if anybody's tried to like strap a camera on like a male elephant seal and just
mm,
watch them under the water.
right? Yeah, that would be really cool. So that actually is something that this study did with the female elephant seals. So they studied not the southern hemisphere species, but the northern elephant seal, which is the other species of living elephant seal, and it's found in the northern hemisphere. Um, and so what they did was they attached a bunch of equipment to a lot of these seals, basically. So they attached satellite transmitters to so they could track where the seals were going. They attached something called mandible accelerometers, and so these are devices that basically measure every time the seals would make a biting motion. So they could measure how often these seals were like catching prey, basically under the water. Now, something that's pretty cool about these devices is that they're quite sophisticated. Like not only in terms of the fact that they can be attached to seals and measure these movements, but also they would only record moments these biting motions when they occurred at a certain depth, because that's where we know that the elephant seals are feeding, right? So they wouldn't like get biting motions when the seals are up at the surface, like if they kind of snap their jaws or something randomly, they wouldn't record that. So it kind of reduces the error there, which is pretty cool. And in fact, these mandible accelerometers have a name. I think it's like the kami machines or something like that, which is in Japanese is onomatopoeia for basically a biting motion. So it's a bit of like the equivalent of a chomp chomp in English. So they gave them a name specifically to describe what they were measuring, basically, which is kind of funny. And to a few of the seals, the researchers also attached video cameras. So mainly this was so they could see what type of prey that these seals were catching. And then they had data loggers also attached to these seals to record all of the data that all these different devices were measuring. So yeah, so with these attached to the seals, they let the seals go off and do their own thing, and they found something quite remarkable. So first of all, in terms of what the seals were eating, these female elephant seals, they were mostly feeding on small fish out in the mesopelagic zone. So that's at a pretty reasonably deep waters, especially for an air-breathing animal to go to. Out in the pelagic, so the open ocean area, so far away from the coast. And this is really interesting because this is pretty much a unique foraging niche among marine mammals. So male elephant seals, on the other hand, tend to feed closer to the coast, and they tend to feed on larger prey items, larger types of fish. Um, and there are other marine mammals that visit the mesopelagic zone, but not many. So most of the other mammals that do so that we know about are toothed whales, or some types of toothed whales at least. So things like sperm whales and many of the beaked whales can dive down to depths like that. Um, but they feed mostly on pretty large types of squid down there. And so they're not going after the small fish that these seals are going after. Um, so that is pretty interesting. Now, and there's probably a reason for this kind of difference, and that is because toothed whales can forage by echolocation, as many of you probably know. So they send out really high-pitched calls in the darkness, and then they bounce off objects nearby and allow them to identify, what's close, and so if it's prey, they can go after it. And so, using this method, they can target these large squid species, even if they're very widely dispersed out in the deep ocean. Um, However, seals do not use echolocation. Interestingly, sorry, a tangent, but interestingly, well, like some years back, there were some reports of people saying, "Oh, maybe we found evidence for echolocation in seals," but I think those reports haven't really held up since then. So, as far as we know, seals do not hunt using echolocation. What they use is their very sensitive whiskers to detect their prey, and that, of course, is quite handy, but it does require them to get very close to their prey items to actually find them, and so they wouldn't be able to sustain themselves like trying to search for these widely dispersed squids out down in the darkness. They instead are going after lots and lots of little fish that form very dense schools down there. And yeah, as far as we know, no other marine mammal kind of does this. It's only the female elephant seals that do. Um, and so they kind of have this niche all to themselves. But there is a trade off, and that is something else that this study found, and that was that female elephant seals need to spend up to between 80 to 100% of their day foraging if they want to gain enough energy to regain the fat that they lost during the breeding season when they were fasting. Um, yeah, so that means like yeah, they on average uh, sleep for only about an hour or so every day, and otherwise they're just constantly foraging down there, and that's also the reason why they stay down there for such long periods of time. Now those toothed whales I mentioned earlier, some of them can dive even deeper than elephant seals do, but they don't usually stay down there for so long. Elephant seals are also somewhat, they're also distinctive in the fact that they stay down in the deep ocean for such long periods of time, and this seems to be the reason why is that they have to stay down there and collect lots and lots and lots of these little fish just to sustain themselves. And the researchers also did some calculations to see, so how much would how long would a male elephant seal need to forage if one of them had to adopt this kind of lifestyle? And it turns out that it would basically be impossible for them because male elephant seals are so much bigger than the females that they would have to forage for like over 300% of their day, which, as you can imagine, is not possible if they were also feeding on these kind of deep ocean small fish. And so they instead feed on larger prey closer to the coast. And closer to the coast is also where predation risk is higher because that tends to be where the orcas and great white sharks hang out, and those are the only two predators of elephant seals other than humans, really. At least of the big adult males. So they also meet a bit of a trade off there. So kind of female elephant seals have reduced predation risk by feeding out in the open ocean, but they have to feed constantly to sustain themselves. Whereas the male elephant seals they stay close to the coast, where they can feed on larger prey. Allowing them to survive and maintain their huge body sizes, but exposes them to more predators. So, yeah, this is a really cool kind of a sexual niche partitioning going on, and is just really cool information in general about the behavior of these elephant seals. What do you think?
Yeah, I think so too. You definitely bring up a really good point about, I guess, certainly the pop culture representation of elephant seals.
Mm.
I am kind of like very used to seeing the common showdowns between the males on the
Yes.
beach, and everybody's always in the way. And like, oh, let's get out of the way because the males are fighting, and it's
Right.
big and it's brutal. But yeah, like in their yeah, I guess in their element, like they'd certainly be more graceful and they kind of like blow expectations out of the water.
Yeah, so to speak.
Um, the sexual niche partitioning, I think, is just really fascinating. I think about other organisms that have like that do the same thing,
Hmm.
and it's like I know like a lot of birds do that too.
Yeah.
You have the males that watch the babies while the females go out and do their own thing.
Hmm.
I mean, I guess penguins essentially. That's kind of
Yeah.
that's a pretty good example. Um, but no, like I think that's incredibly fascinating. Now I wonder what's a small fish to an elephant seal?
Yeah, good question. I think when they say small fish, they actually mean like pretty small fish. I'm not I don't remember and I'm not familiar with the specific fish that they talked about the elephant seals eating, but I mean, I'm guessing here, so I might be wrong, but I guess they would be similar to things like lanternfish, which are some of the most abundant like vertebrates on Earth, numbering in like God, like many zeros basically. So there's like there are like lots and lots and lots of really small fish down in like the moderately deep ocean, and they are really important part of like ocean ecosystems, as can be seen here. And so, yeah, one of the main takeaways from the paper actually was that basically what they were saying is that female elephant seals have kind of hit on an ecological niche that is unique among marine mammals, which is good for them, but also their findings also show how they're sort of at their limit of being able to sustain this lifestyle, right? Like they're spending like almost 100% of their day feeding. So if there's any kind of environmental disruption that say reduces the numbers of these fish, then it would be very difficult for them to adapt to that. And so that is definitely something we should be concerned about.
Yeah, for sure. Because yeah, pinnipeds. I'm talking in general.
Yeah.
Seals, sea lions, and walruses. They're kind of interesting as far as marine mammals go
Hmm.
because, like, yes, they can go up on land and they can waddle around as best as they
Hmm.
can. But like they are more at home in the water it
Hmm.
seems, and it's like they're almost it's like it's just a couple of like adaptations away from like doing what whales have done really,
Right.
which is that's just fascinating to me. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Yeah, it is quite interesting that they haven't, become fully aquatic yet, since we certainly know it's possible for mammals to do so, and they've done so more than once. Um, but yeah, it is quite interesting. I have to wonder if it has to do with like the state of the young, because carnivorans tend to have, relatively helpless youngsters that are born kind of blind and naked and all that, or
Yeah,
at
right,
least,
right.
yeah, or at least sparsely haired. Whereas things like sea cows and whales, they descended from mammals with probably with precocial young um, that could run around very soon after birth. So I've always wondered if that has something to do with it, and maybe, but I'm not a mammal expert, so yeah, I don't know if
Yeah.
anyone's looked into that.
Yeah, I imagine it's a combination of that and also
Right,
just there are already whales
exactly.
in the ocean that they do the same thing that the seals would do.
Right, right.
Well, I guess except for the female elephant seals, of course.
Right, yeah.
Gosh, 80 to 100% of the day eating. Like that's I'm trying to like compare that like if a human tried to do that.
Right, right.
I mean, I do like to sleep. I do like to eat.
Yes.
But I wouldn't be that committed to eating.
Right, yeah, like definitely that's it's almost almost unthinkable. Yeah, like if we had to do that, I would be right here like munching on stuff right now.
Yeah. Oh, there's just no way.
Yeah. Now, I do have a figure of the paper on the next slide to show, and this is basically showing a comparison between body size and dive depth in mammals, and you can see just how weird elephant seals are. Um, so on the x-axis on the bottom, that is a body size, and on the y-axis is the depth to which these animals are known to dive. And you can see, from the color coding scheme here that the deepest diving mammals that we know of are various kinds of toothed whales. So I think the current record is held by a species of beaked whale, and also the sperm whales can also dive pretty deep. But then you have the female elephant seals on here in the kind of pink square up in the kind of mid upper left, um, and they are much smaller than these toothed whales, but they can also dive to incredible depths. And yeah, this just goes to show kind of what a unique kind of combination of, I guess, ecological characteristics they have hit upon. Um, and yeah, that's definitely really interesting.
Yeah, that is very fascinating. That's a great paper, Albert.
Thanks. Yeah, I definitely thought it was a really interesting study, and so I wanted to talk about it naturally. But yeah, I guess if you have nothing else to add, we can go to your first study.
Yeah, sure, we can do that. Um, if you've been keeping up with my series, Humanity: A Prologue,
Mm,
then you'll kind of already be, familiar with this understanding that humans as major landscape shapers. We are megafauna after all. In most environments, we have dramatically altered the composition of the environment through direct action,
mm,
for better or for worse. Now, one of the ways we've done so is through the use of fire. The archaeological record points to our lineage using fire for at least a million years,
mm,
but likely longer. And during the time of Homo sapiens, and this is especially going into the Holocene epoch, fire use has just increased and has become a huge shaper of ecology. Many communities around the world have set artificial wildfires to forests and grasslands with the goals of eliminating underbrush and weeds, encouraging new growth on the refertilized soil, as well as assisting in the hunt. You encourage certain animals to go into places that you then want to eat.
mm,
Now, evidence for this sort of use of fire goes back in the archaeo-environmental record at least 50 to 40,000 years ago in about Southeast Asia and Australia. But researchers have suspected that our species had been shaping landscapes in this way for quite a bit longer than that. Now, at the Chitimwe beds in northwestern Lake Malawi, in the country of Malawi, Jessica C. Thompson and colleagues have analyzed over 400,000 years of stratigraphic records to paint a picture of how the environment changed over time, with or without human intervention. And what they found had basically confirmed these suspicions of archaeologists. So, the history of Lake Malawi has been known for quite a while now. Between 80 and roughly 100,000 years ago, the principal driver of change in the region was the climate. In episode 8 of my series, I had mentioned the series of extreme mega droughts that reduced the lake to a series of ponds beginning around 135,000 years ago, and then only just ending around 70,000 years ago. The first good signs of human activity in this region begin around 92,000 years ago, and some researchers have argued that the harsh, dry periods like these mega droughts would have influenced human history in East Africa, including a role as a pump that would have pushed some communities into Eurasia, kickstarting that whole process. Well, this study adds a little bit more context to these events, showing that at least in this part of Lake Malawi, conditions actually got better a little bit earlier, around
mm,
86,000 years ago, and the ecosystem had become a woodland savanna with increased rainfall. So going kind of previously from a tropical rainforest to this new sort of environment. Now, it's all around this time that the presence of alluvial fans is noted in the records. Now, this is a geologic term for an area where rocks and minerals carried by a stream are deposited, and they sometimes fan out, hence the name. Now, prior to 70,000 years ago, we don't find evidence of alluvial fans in the beds, and their presence in the records corresponds very sharply to the rise in human activity by the lakeside. Now, their increased use of fire altered the composition of the vegetation. They made it less diverse in species but more fire resistant over time. And this shifting of flora meant that erosion and topsoil loss was more likely along the hillsides. And given that rainfall had increased following the megadroughts, this combined to expand the depositional processes that created these alluvial fans. Now, the researchers state that they're unsure just how the local wildlife would have responded to these sorts of things, because unfortunately there's a lack of faunal remains in these beds.
Hmm.
But it seems very likely that they would have been affected too,
All right.
particularly the herbivore communities. Now, the images to the right of this slide kind of give a rough overview of the changes in northern Lake Malawi over 400,000 years that the paper talks about. So we go from a less populated human landscape to the time of the mega droughts, and then back to the top we have the rise in human occupation and fire use as described previously. And by about 40,000 years ago, the previous anthropogenic trends only increased further, and so the area is definitely what you could call a human habitat.
Hmm.
Now, this study adds yet another piece of evidence for extending our understanding of the human relationship to the natural world, into the Pleistocene and beyond. The types of changes that we are seeing during our own lifetimes are, just the latest in a long series of environmental shaping done by our ancestors. The question now, of course, is can we keep it on a sustainable path
Hmm.
and prevent the total collapse of, global ecosystems as many of these communities seem to have done in the past. Um, but regardless of that, it's very clear, and the researchers state outright that one of the key drivers in the shaping of a landscape like Lake Malawi over the past 70,000 years, has been human activity,
Hmm.
and this is probably likely true for many places around the world. It's just a matter of understanding how and what triggered these processes for human communities in the first place.
Hmm.
So I thought that was a pretty fascinating look into this phenomenon. What do you think, Albert?
Yeah, me too. I I know we probably mentioned this on your series before, but yeah, there's this idea that oh we have to preserve these pristine wildernesses out in the that are left in the world today, but really like pristine wilderness like essentially well that doesn't really exist anywhere where humans have habitated, right?
Yeah,
We've been changing these landscapes um, for ages and ages, and I it's like you said. It's the question is, how can we keep it at sustainable levels that so both us and the other organisms that share these environments can continue to thrive. Um, and yeah, I definitely think I've definitely seen or at least noticed, even being outside of the anthropological community strictly, um, I've definitely noticed more and more of these studies about these kind of ancient or relatively ancient anthropogenic changes to landscapes, and I think they're definitely really worth studying, and it's great that we're getting so much insight into these activities and changes.
definitely. And certainly, like more research, is always welcome. And I think would especially be helpful is to see, just how different organisms react to these sorts of anthropogenic changes in the past.
Hmm.
Not just the plants but the animals as well. I know the study didn't exactly have the resources available to look into that, but I
Right.
mean, there are certainly better archaeological sites with non-human animal remains that could help kind of piece this together. Um, and so I know like that research is slowly coming in, and
Mm.
it'll be interesting to look into that for sure. Um, I mean, like you definitely do bring up a good point. I mean, yeah, pristine wilderness. Um, Honestly, like pretty much almost anywhere where humans have gone, with a fairly few exceptions, there has been a drive to kind of carve a place into the natural world
Hmm.
and modify it to human needs rather than let nature, modify you into like its into the, I guess, the natural flow of things. Um,
Right.
like, I mean, gosh, many societies around the world have, like, through tilling and digging and creating dams and dikes and artificial rivers and mound building. It just, yeah, like it's almost like you'd almost like have to look hard to find a place where humans haven't, altered things in a slight way.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Even down to like the kinds of animals in certain environments, because
Right.
of course people bring animals with them all the time, and they can radiate and spread out on their own, and that wouldn't have happened if people weren't there.
Hmm.
So, it's very fascinating to me. And certainly we'll probably see more studies like this in the near future, and
Yeah.
kind of break down what they can teach us about ecology and environmental practices and that sort of thing.
Hmm.
um, yeah, I guess if you don't have anything else to add, we can jump into your next story.
Oh sure. Yeah. Let me see. Okay. Okay. Yeah. So this is a really cool study, and so in general on this show, we like to cover studies that receive relatively little attention from kind of mainstream news media. However, this one did see quite a bit of press, um, but I still decided to talk about it anyway because it is very intimately relevant to my interests. Um, and so this study looked at the evolution of vision and hearing in theropod dinosaurs, and specifically, it found some really interesting things about some of my favorite theropod dinosaur groups. Um, but first, let's take a look, or let's break it down and see what they found. Um, so, in terms of vision, what they did was that the authors took measurements of the sclerotic ring and eye socket from a range of reptiles, but focusing on theropods. But they also looked at like a ton of lizards and a few other dinosaurs as well. And I guess just in case anyone is not familiar, theropod dinosaurs are the group that includes basically all the or at least most of the carnivorous dinosaurs, and they are also the group that includes birds, so they are a group of dinosaurs that is still alive today. But of course, way back in the Mesozoic, there were a lot of other lineages of theropod dinosaurs other than birds alive then as well. Um, and in any case, the authors here were looking at the size of the sclerotic ring and the eye socket. And if you're not familiar with the sclerotic ring, this is a ring of little bones, or rather a series of little bones that forms a ring that it gets embedded in the eyeball of many kinds of vertebrates. So we mammals are actually kind of weird in that we don't have the sclerotic ring. But a lot of distant mammal ancestors did, and most reptiles do. So there have been a number of previous studies that have looked at how the proportions of the sclerotic ring might correlate with the habits of animals. So some people have suggested that animals with relatively large sclerotic rings compared to the size of the rest of the eye socket might be more likely to be nocturnal. And in fact, back in I think 2011 or so, there was a study that came out looking at the size of sclerotic ring in a range of extinct reptiles, uh, done by I know one of the authors on that previous paper is also one of the authors on this paper, so of course I imagine they are familiar with the method. Um, and they basically concluded that there was this range of Mesozoic dinosaurs and some pterosaurs even that might have been nocturnal based on the size of their the sclerotic ring, and those conclusions have been some debated by some other researchers. Um, I think in general, uh, more studies have come out trying to um, see how good the fit is between activity levels and kind of sclerotic ring proportions in living animals. So people have looked at things like lizards and modern birds and things. And I would say the general impression I'm getting is that there probably is some correlation with activity level uh, in term with sclerotic ring size. Um, But in terms of like extrapolating that to extinct animals, it kind of depends on how high you set your statistical threshold, basically. So basically, how strongly statistically supported do you have to get before you can confidently infer that something is nocturnal or not? I think that can create some different results depending. But in this study, they set a pretty high threshold for that. Um, and so what you're seeing in the graph down below is you see all these little dots with the rounded dots are basically modern animals. So in this case, mostly lizards and birds, and then the squares are mostly extinct reptiles. Um, and so they did find that the nocturnal lizards and birds, so the ones that are colored like closer to the purpley blue color, um, they do tend to cluster in this case in um, the upper right of the chart, whereas the diurnal species tend to be spread down further below in the chart. And so from this, they found that there are a few extinct theropods that cluster up pretty cleanly with the nocturnal living reptiles. And so this is really interesting. So the three species that they found with a very strong probability of having been nocturnal based on kind of sclerotic ring proportions were Megapnosaurus, which is a very early theropod from like the early Jurassic. It's very similar to you're probably familiar with Coelophysis from the Triassic. It's very similar to that. In fact, some paleontologists classify them in the same genus but different species. So in that case, Megapnosaurus would be a species of Coelophysis instead. But when it's considered its own genus, it's called a Megapnosaurus, which for various reasons people don't really like. I guess that's a tangent.
Yeah, by the sake of it used to be Centarsus, right?
Right. That's right. Yeah, so if you see the name Centarsus in classic dinosaur books, that's referring to Megapnosaurus, what we call Megapnosaurus now, because it turns out that the name Centarsus had already been used for a beetle, and that means that the dinosaur had to be renamed. And so it was renamed Megapnosaurus. But the problem was the scientists who renamed it to Megapnosaurus were not dinosaur paleontologists, they were entomologists, and they were under the mistaken impression that the original author who named the dinosaur Centarsus had passed away. And so, of course, it generally we consider it polite to let the original namer rename the animal if a situation like this happens. But because they thought he had passed away, they decided to go ahead and do it themselves. And they decided to name it Megapnosaurus, which translates to big dead lizard. And yeah, I guess some people find that insulting, and so they don't really like this name. Um, and Megapnosaurus is not even a really big dinosaur. Like things like Coelophysis, like dinosaurs were, they were around human size roughly, like probably on average a bit smaller than a human. So yeah, it's a lot of people don't like this name because of the circumstances surrounding it. But or because of the rules of nomenclature, we're kind of stuck with it unless you decide to sink it into Coelophysis, of course. And so that's one of the theropods that was strongly plotted among the nocturnal species here based on sclerotic ring size. Now, two other theropods, extinct theropods, that were recovered as being likely nocturnal were Haplochirus and Shibuya. And so that is really interesting because Shibuya and Haplochirus are both types of alvarezsaurs, and we've talked about alvarezsaurs before. In fact, I think in our very first episode we talked about alvarezsaurs. So alvarezsaurs are one of my favorite groups of animals ever. And in fact, if you've been paying attention, my kind of avatar for the show is an alvarezsaur, so that tells you something. And they were this group of very strange little theropods. So in the the late Cretaceous forms, they had evolved this really unusual kind of forelimb anatomy where the forelimbs are really, really short, and only one of the fingers was greatly enlarged. So they basically have a very large thumb claw, but their other two fingers, they had three fingers in total, at least in most species, um, had been greatly reduced. So they were tiny little fingers. So functionally, they essentially had only one claw on each hand. And in fact, um, at least one of them, Lingonicus, actually did basically lose the other two fingers completely and really was completely one clawed per hand. Um, and these forelimbs, even though they were so short, uh, had these really prominent kind of attachment points for muscles, and so people have long speculated, oh, what could these arms have been for? And the leading hypothesis at the moment is that probably they were useful for breaking into hard substrates, say insect nests or tree bark or things like that, and then kind of exposing little prey items inside, so probably insect larvae and things. Um, and they have other features of their anatomy that seem to go along with this, like their skulls are very long and delicate, and they have a lot of little small teeth. Not so much like big blade-like teeth like you would typically see in other theropods. And so in general, and I wrote an entire blog post about this. I think that the hypothesis that they mostly hunted kind of insects in these hard substrates is pretty plausible. And even though the small size of the arms is really counterintuitive, there are actually good reasons to have kind of small forelimbs if you are a digging animal. So I kind of elaborate on all that in my blog post, so I guess I'll drop a link to that. But yeah, in any case, that's the case in the kind of late Cretaceous species. And all of these were, or most of them were really small animals. Like most of them were between the size of a pigeon to the size of a turkey. So they were tiny theropods. Um, and there we do have a few kind of earlier forms of alvarezsaurs that have been identified in the fossil record from the early Cretaceous and the late Jurassic. And so Haplachyrus is one of these late Jurassic forms, and so it gives us a sense of how these strange alvarezsaurs evolved. And Haplachyrus was basically an alvarezsaur that looked normal, as I've heard it described. So it basically looked like your typical small theropod. It still wasn't very big, but it was bigger than most of the later species. So it was about 2 meters long or so. Would have been much shorter than a human in terms of height. And yeah, it basically had fairly normal theropod features, like its teeth. Some of them were still blade-like. Although a few of its teeth weren't. So it probably had maybe a sort of mixed diet of it could still catch relatively large prey, but was probably also going after insects as well, maybe even plants to some extent. And its hands were still largely pretty normal hands for a theropod of this type. So it had like these three fingers, with the second finger, the pointer finger, being the longest. However, it did have a slightly enlarged kind of thumb claw, so kind of a sign of things to come, you could say. So yeah, and what the study found was that there is strong evidence that both this early alvarezsaur Haplachyrus and this late Cretaceous alvarezsaur Shibuya might have been nocturnal. So that is a really cool kind of finding. And also, I guess, just to explain the figure to the right, because we went over the graph earlier. This is showing on the top. B is showing the skull of an owlet nightjar. So this is a nocturnal bird, closely related to swifts and hummingbirds. And so we covered the group Strysaures in one of the episodes of my series, Dinosaurs, the second chapter. And this is also one of my favorite groups of birds, and a group that I've worked quite heavily on in my own research. And basically, a lot of members of this group are nocturnal. You have like owlet nightjars, like the one pictured here, but you also have things like frogmouths and potus and the true nightjars. And you can see that the sclerotic ring is really big compared to the eye socket here. And C, to the right, is the skull of Haplachyrus, and you can see that it also has a really big sclerotic ring too. And on the bottom to our two theropods that we either know are not nocturnal or have been inferred to not have been nocturnal. And so D is the skull of a parrot, and so this is a diurnal parrot, and so its sclerotic ring is a bit more modestly sized compared to those nocturnal theropods. And E is a therizinosaur or Lycosaurus. Therizinosaurs were these big, well, yeah, most of them were relatively big, although not all of them were. Um, these big herbivorous theropods with like huge claws on their hands. And so this study found that Erlikosaurus, which has one of the best preserved skulls of any therizinosaur that we know of, had quite a small sclerotic ring, and so it more likely was diurnal and less likely was nocturnal. And so this study looked not only at the vision, but also hearing, which we'll go over on the next slide, of theropods. And so what they did was they measured, or they looked at the inner ear, because the structures of the inner ear usually have leave cavities in the skull that can be looked at even in fossil forms if the skull is sufficiently well preserved. And so you can see these funky looking 3D models here. These are models of basically the inner ear cavities in the skull of various theropods. And so, looking at the inner ear in theropods, they found more evidence that alvarezsaurs might have been nocturnal. And so, what they found was, well, I guess to help orient ourselves here, I guess if you look all the way to the right of the graphic here, you can see those two red inner ear cavities. So on the top is the inner ear cavity of Shibuya, one of those late Cretaceous alvarezsaurs, and on the bottom is the inner ear cavity of a barn owl, which of course is a nocturnal bird and one of the most superbly adapted nocturnal hunters out there in the modern day. And so it's got some really interesting features, this barn owl inner ear. So the kind of circular structures on the top, those are called semicircular canals, and pretty much all vertebrates have them. They are involved in the sense of balance. Basically, they sense when your head is tilted and whatever. And some people have tried to figure out if we can determine kind of various aspects of animal biology from the structure of the semicircular canals, but there's a fair bit of debate about that I won't go into for this episode. However, on the bottom there, that is the cochlear duct. So that is if you've seen diagrams of ear anatomy, in the inner ear there's a structure that looks like a coiled snail shell. That is the cochlea, and so the cochlear duct is basically where the cochlea goes. And the cochlea has little what we call hair cells inside inside it, and they are basically what detect the vibrations of sound that gets transmitted to them through the outer ear deep in, when sound goes through the outer ear and eventually reaches the inner ear. These the hair cells inside the cochlea receive these vibrations and transmit it to the brain, which then interprets these signals. And so something really weird about the cochlear duct in barn owls is that it is really long, and you can see that here. And you can compare that to the series of inner ears in the graph in B and C. So these are the inner ears of various other theropods, and you can see that in Shibuya, similarly to the barn owl, the cochlear duct is really long, whereas in Haplocyrus, Signraptor, and Conchoraptor, they are much shorter. Now, Haplocyrus also has a kind of moderately long inner ear, so that might also be consistent with a nocturnal habit as well. And so, well, what this probably correlates with is the ability to detect really low frequency sounds with the ear. So barn owls are amazing at hunting by ear. We also talked a little bit about this in my series Dinosaurs, the second chapter, when we talked about owls. Yeah, a barn owl can basically find its prey in basically pitch darkness, even if it can't see a thing, because it's got these really sensitive ears, and it's able to detect like these really small rustling noises that its prey makes. And it seems from this research that Shibuya had a very similar adaptation, this really long cochlear duct. And you can see this also plotted on the graph all the way to the left in A as well. So the barn owl ear is Tyto alba. That's the scientific name of the barn owl, and it's marked in the graph. And you can also see Shibuya as an orange square down closer to the lower left. But they kind of plot along the same trend line, far above the rest of the other theropods. Um, Something else that this study found is that in theropods other than birds, so the graph in C shows like the Mesozoic theropods, and D shows the modern birds. On average, Mesozoic theropods had longer cochlear ducts than modern birds, but they still span a pretty wide range of values there. All right, so I guess just to summarize, how does this fit into our previous understanding of alvarezsaur biology? I think the study is really interesting. So first of all, I guess it makes a lot of sense to me that alvarezsaurs might have foraged by night. Certainly, a lot of kind of ant-eating mammals are nocturnal foragers today. Things like aardvarks and pangolins and many of the anteaters all prefer to come out at night. And plus, alvarezsaurs were really small animals, probably coming out by night, feeding by night might have been safer for them than feeding by day. Um, but also this really elongated cochlear duct in Shibuya, suggesting that it might have been able to forage by hearing. I also found very interesting because there are, in fact, kind of ant and termite eating animals today that do this. And I'm kind of surprised that, as far as I can tell, this wasn't mentioned in the paper. So the bat-eared fox from Africa is a type of fox, as its name suggests, that primarily feeds on termites. And the main way that it finds termites is it listens for them. It has these big ears, that's why it's called the bat-eared fox, and it is able to hear termites basically moving around underground. And so the bat-eared fox it doesn't really have any adaptations for like digging into hard termite mounds. It basically has normal kind of fox legs, so it can't do that. But what it does do is that it can hear them kind of moving around right underneath the soil, and so it scratches them up while they're moving underneath the soil, and then it licks them up from the ground. And it does that by finding them with its hearing. So yeah, I think these findings really fit into this picture of alvarezsaurs as kind of predators of social insects, because it seems to suggest that they could feed in such a similar manner as well. So I definitely thought this was really, really cool. And also, like I said, because I like the group of birds, Strysaures, so much, things like the nightjars and owlet nightjars and potus. I think it is really cool that we have this kind of convergent similarity between Strysaurians and alvarezsaurs, two of my favorite theropod groups, that they are both nocturnal. So yeah, I can say, wow, how is an alvarezsaur like a nightbird? Yeah, they are both nocturnal. I think that's really amazing. Though for the record, owls are not members of Strysaures, even though they are also nocturnal. So we covered this in Dinosaurs, the second chapter. So go check that out if you want to learn more about bird phylogeny. But yeah, anyways, I really like this study. I've actually heard about this study for a while because it was presented in part. Some of its findings were presented at SVP in 2019, and that's a Society of Vertebrate Paleontology conference. And also, I'd actually met some of the authors on this study before, and they kind of mentioned to me before, like, oh yeah, you like alvarezsaurs, so we found this really cool thing, and so yeah, I've been waiting for this study to be published for a while, and I'm glad it's out. The findings are super cool. I think this is really gives us a good sense of how these animals were living, and again, I just love that kind of my two favorite theropod groups have this kind of connection, not phylogenetically, but in terms of like convergent ecologies, which is really amazing. So yeah, do you have anything to say about this?
No, I think it's amazing. I mean, it certainly fleshes out the Mesozoic era
Mm-hmm.
quite a bit because, oh my gosh, maybe this shows my age a little bit. Some of the books I had growing up, I still remember these images of these big, sluggish dinosaurs
Mm,
going to sleep at night while all the little mammals could go out at night and have their
right.
fun. And I always wonder, like, but like, would there have been nocturnal dinosaurs?
Mm-hmm.
Like, like the way that we have nocturnal mammals and birds and stuff today. And I mean, studies like this certainly seem to point in that direction.
Right.
it makes a lot of sense, certainly. It certainly makes more sense for alvarezsaurs to be nocturnal animals than to be, say, oh, I don't know, oxpecker analogs.
Oh. Yeah, I wonder where you got that idea.
Oh, yeah. I guess not to go too deep into this, but so there's a guy called David Peters, and if you're familiar with paleontology at all, you might have seen him or at least seen some of his stuff if you Googled certain animals. Uh, I don't think independent researcher would be the right word to use. He's sort of a pseudoscientist who's certainly an accomplished artist, but he has kind of got it in his head that he has discovered these these features and relationships of certain prehistoric animals,
Mhm.
including pterosaurs especially.
Yep.
And he's figured it out, and everybody else is a fool,
Mm.
and he is always right, and he just hasn't been able to get his stuff out there because the man is out there. The big ivory tower scientists are putting him down,
You're
and
right.
and so he's just flooded the internet with all of his work. He has a blog and he has an independent website, and he just keeps putting out all of this research, quote unquote, which basically amounts to him taking photos of fossils, so not actual fossils themselves, and using this method where like he kind of opens up like a Photoshop program and like uses all kinds of filters
You're
to
right.
like see things that are otherwise hidden in the fossil, and then draw attention to them to show, oh, we actually have all these features of these animals anatomy that nobody else has seen, but I found them.
You're
And
right.
they usually amount to these ridiculous abominations that just would not, really function well as biological organisms to begin with. Um,
Yeah.
Not to mention the phylogenetic relationships that he's come up with. So he has the big reptile tree, and he's picked like what was it, like 500 characters?
Something like that.
Yeah,
Few
of course,
hundred.
characters being like anatomical traits that can be compared between organisms, and he has not like adjusted that number, so keep that in mind. He basically like he reclassified the entire reptile family tree and got all these relationships that no other researchers have you know recovered because the evidence has not pointed in that direction. From like actual analysis of the bones, let alone the
Right.
DNA. But like he's also just extended this, so now his big reptile tree includes fish and mammals, and he is just stirring up those groups as much as he has with the reptiles, and it's yeah. So would you is that fair to say like that's a good introduction?
Yeah, I think that's that's a pretty good introduction. Yeah, so we won't be sharing his website in the description because goodness knows he does not need more traffic driven there. Um,
No. What we could
but
do is we could so Darren Naish, of course,
right.
will pour a drink. We talk about him again.
Yes.
Um, he's written a really wonderful article explaining this whole situation and why we should ignore it. Um,
Right.
and that if there's only one thing you need to know about David Peters, it's look. We'll put that blog up there. You
Yeah,
can
exactly.
find out for yourself.
Yes, we'll put that up there. Just yeah, it's a really good explainer on the history of David Peters' ideas and why they're not exactly scientifically rigorous or trustworthy. Um, yeah, but yeah, the reason we brought him up in the first place was that yes, he also proposed that alvarezsaurs were like somewhat or like oxpecker analogs, and they would cling to larger dinosaurs to feed on their parasites. And oh gosh, yeah. Well, what's really funny about that idea is that he was inspired to write that because of my blog post. Were you aware of this?
I think you've mentioned that
Yeah,
before.
like yeah, like when he came up with the idea, his post where he comes up with that idea, he links to my blog post and said this post was inspired by this other blog post and it was mine, and I was like, okay, well, thanks for the credit, I guess, but yeah, no, I do not find that. plausible. Anyways, yes. So yeah, I guess that's probably all we should say about that. And yeah, I guess coming back to kind of nocturnal Mesozoic dinosaurs, something else that's worth bringing up here is that one of the few groups of Mesozoic dinosaurs that have long been suspected to be nocturnal are the troodontids, which are a group that are closely related to birds and also closely related to dromaeosaurids. They're closely related to things like Velociraptor and Deinonychus. Um, but in general, the troodontids tend to be more slender in their overall form. Probably they were going after smaller prey than the dromaeosaurids on average. Um, and they also appear to have had really big eyes, and they have some features suggestive of sensitive hearing, so they have often been suspected to be nocturnal animals. And if you look at the chart here, looking at the chart in C, for example, that bar chart, you can see that Shibuya has the longest kind of cochlear duct among all these Mesozoic theropods. But the other orange bar next to it, that is a troodontid. So yeah, this study also found support for this kind of potentially nocturnal kind of foraging by ear kind of behavior in troodontids, which had been suspected before. So that is also really cool. In fact, it is also marked on the scatter plot on the left as well. So the kind of long string that says IGM 100/1126, pointing to another orange square, that is a troodontid specimen, and because it hasn't been named yet, so that's why it's being referred to by its specimen number instead. But yeah, so that's one of the other Mesozoic theropods that seems to have had like an owl-like kind of inner ear, which is really cool.
Yeah, that's really neat. So seems like we're mostly looking at theropods here.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, from what I could see from the chart, I'm very curious, like what the I guess the other groups of dinosaurs would have to show for as far as
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think for the inner ear, they seem to have mostly been looking at theropods. They did include some other dinosaurs in the sclerotic ring part of their study, but yeah, I think they were focusing on theropods for this part. So I'd agree. I would be really interested to see what we find when we if we look at other dinosaurs. I know there have been a few studies that looked at inner ear anatomy in say sauropods and other non-theropod dinosaurs. Um, but yeah, I don't think anyone has identified any kind of clear signal of like nocturnal habits in those. But also they were most of those other dinosaurs were herbivores, so I guess you wouldn't really expect them to have um, this kind of inner ear anyway that seems to have been mostly used for detecting prey. So yeah, I guess it kind of makes sense that people haven't noticed this before in other dinosaurs. But yeah, it definitely would be cool to have a closer examination of those and see if we find any interesting patterns.
yeah, and I imagine like there's certainly some blending too. I
Hmm.
mean, we talk about diurnal versus nocturnal, but
Oh
of course,
yeah,
like there are animals that are like active at dawn or at dusk,
right.
so they can kind
Or
of
yeah, or animals that don't really care and just just are active whenever. Yeah, definitely.
That's true, absolutely. This is incredible study. It definitely fleshes out the Mesozoic, and I'd love to see further work on this.
Hmm. Yeah, totally. I absolutely agree there. But I guess if we have nothing else to add to this, we can go on to our final, last but not least study.
Sure, absolutely. So,
Ooh.
okay. Um, so this next paper deals with the causes of Pleistocene extinctions. Now,
Mm.
I guess for the larger scope of this topic, I had previously given my 2 cents into the discourse surrounding this back in episode 10 of my series, Humanity: A Prologue. Um, and I've read more on this subject since then, and it's led me to very interesting places. But that's a story for another time. This particular paper, which is by Julian Louis and colleagues, is in the context of island extinctions.
Mm.
So as far as the Holocene is concerned, our understanding of the losses of so many unique and fascinating species of plants and animals is generally well understood. In nearly all cases, the first humans to settle these various islands, like Madagascar or the Pacific Islands or what have you, the Caribbean, and then bringing with them, fellow travelers like rats and pigs and cats. They were the direct causes of those extinctions.
Mm.
So then the question begs, well, what about island colonization during the Pleistocene? We know of just as many unique island animals that died out back then. Well, did the humans who first landed there do them in too? And well, that's exactly what this paper set out to study. So the authors examined 37 different islands that have had known human occupation within the last 50,000 years or so, and they range the gamut from the British Isles to the Japanese archipelago to Wallacea, which is island Southeast Asia, to the Mediterranean. And so these charts here on the right kind of give chronological timescales for all these different islands, showing the ranges of different organisms, first colonization by humans, as well as other events like particular volcanic eruptions that occurred. Um, and as an important note, these islands are divided into two categories. You have the oceanic islands, so like those that have always been islands from their inception, at least during this time, and those that were once connected to the mainland continents. So, like I mentioned, the British Isles, famously, England was connected to mainland Europe during the last ice age into a landmass known as Doggerland. And so like that was part of that larger phenomenon, and it wouldn't have really been called an island for much of its history.
Mm.
Now, the victims include all manner of animals, from elephants and rhinos to deer and rodents. We have marsupials as well as different flightless birds. So there's a sample size is fairly good here that we're looking at. And all of this is compared with both the archaeological record as well as the environmental records that are available to kind of give us as clear a chronology as possible to examine the causes of these species losses. Now, an entry point that the authors make into this discourse is the fact that island faunas, especially oceanic ones, tend to undergo frequent turnovers, as the closed nature of the environment means that resources and genetic diversity usually remain fairly small. Now, sea level changes can play major roles in shaping island life too. It's very simple. Sea level rises, the island shrinks, and vice versa. Thus, it seems island animals tend to be particularly vulnerable to extinctions, more so than on the continents. And similarly, hominin colonization of islands is limited by a number of factors relating to resource availability. The authors point out a lack of available freshwater sources, as well as the range of terrestrial foods, are typically the factors that affect where and how our ancestors made their homes. And so, just to kind of change the slide here real quick to show another aspect of the study, these are some other islands that have been examined. Now, right away, the authors cast their doubts that humans played any significant roles in species losses. So they look at pre sapiens hominins like Floresiensis or Antecessor that have lived on islands for as much as 1 million years with little evidence of extinctions by their hand. At most, the loss of a few species on Crete and maybe Luzon in Southeast Asia might be attributed to the arrival of those specific hominins, but otherwise it's very difficult to say. Now, some of the animals on the islands concerned died out long after first contact, and in other cases, they found no connections at all. Similarly, for islands where Homo sapiens first settled, so we're dealing with our species now, and when continental islands are discussed in this context, the evidence is just as slim. Uh, those particular extinctions seem to have made more sense in relating to rising sea levels.
Mm.
The most dramatic example being the environmental changes that occurred as Sundaland became island Southeast Asia after the last glacial period. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that the sea level rise was particularly rapid there. So you had all sorts of coastlines that were just rapidly covered up by seawater, which of course killed a lot of the coastal communities that couldn't escape in time. Similarly, in the British Isles, too, I mean, the loss of species is better explained by the growth of ice sheets taking over the land during the last ice age than
Hmm.
with the arrival of Homo sapiens. Of course, Europe is an interesting case because humans were essentially booted out of northern Europe during the last glacial period because of the rising glaciers.
Right.
So it wasn't repopulated until much later. So basically, in most cases, the links between faunal extinctions and human contact were found to be slim to none. And whatever links were found in the archaeological record between humans and the species that they directly hunted, so we actually have evidence of contact. Well, in almost all those cases, the animals concerned have survived to the present day. The authors go after example, showing this group of people hunted babirussas. Well, there are still babirussas around. Well, this group of people hunted wild pigs, and well, these particular pigs are still around, and on and on and on. So then the question goes, why then were the Holocene island extinctions different? If there weren't any major extinctions in the Pleistocene by humans landing on these different islands.
Hmm.
And simply put, these anthropogenic extinctions are coupled with a larger phenomenon of human cultural change. Of course, during the Holocene, we had new technologies for both hunting and overseas travel. There are shifts in subsistence practices. Of course, Holocene humans are beginning to use agriculture and are domesticating animals. Um, Communities are growing larger and larger, and there's also the incorporation of commensal animals, where all these were all aspects of life that Pleistocene humans didn't really experience.
Hmm.
Um, and so the circumstances are different, the authors argue, and that earlier humans simply lacked the cultural elements that could lead to wholesale island extinctions of the sort that we find in Holocene records. A great example of this direction and this distinction, of course, is given for Miyako Island. This is in Japan. There was a species of roe deer that lived there when humans first settled on that island during the Pleistocene. But their extinction, it seems to have been tied to groups of later people arriving on the island and bringing with them pigs, which would have been towards the end of the Pleistocene
Hmm.
or the beginning of the Holocene. And the pigs seem to have pushed those deer to the brink of extinction through competition. In fact, in many of these cases, introduced species often play more of a role in endemic island extinctions than direct hunting did.
Hmm.
Um, in Albert's series, we talked about the dodo, for example. This is a very
Right.
late example that, contrary to the popular discussion that humans killed these birds to extinctions, it was actually the rats that ate their eggs and caused those population pressures that were likely the main reason that those birds died out. And this just can be found for both small and large animals too. So, in the end, the biggest takeaway from this paper, and if I'm being completely honest, this is a little bit unsurprising, in my opinion.
Hmm.
Um, these sort of simplistic answers to the question of Pleistocene extinctions are not really accurate when
Hmm.
we look at the data itself. Based on what we know, it does not seem likely that human settlement of islands during the later Pleistocene played a large or even significant role in the extinction of so many island species, and the fact that the factors that went into them were a lot more complex than just that. Um, so there is a distinct difference, it seems, between island extinctions in the Pleistocene and those of the Holocene, which again are facilitated by new cultural changes that occurred among human populations. And so this paper kind of brings to attention those aspects and argues for more a deeper look into these sorts of questions
Hmm.
because the Holocene extinctions have been sort of the poster child for further research. In fact, as I understand it, like the so-called overkill hypothesis that Paul Martin had started, which is sort of the big one of the big sides of this discourse. A big part of that was inspired by island extinctions in the Holocene.
Right.
You know, Humans arrive on these islands and all these unique animals just die out due to their pressures on this new environment. Uh, but humans have changed quite a bit over just a short period of time, and so maybe it's a false equivalency to take those extinctions and use that lens to look at them during the Pleistocene epoch.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I'm curious as to your thoughts.
Yeah, it's certainly an interesting study, and I imagine it will cause a fair bit of discourse if it hasn't already. Um, yeah, you know, like I mentioned during the when you covered Pleistocene extinctions in general during Humanity a Prologue. It's certainly the topic is very well trodden ground, and I can't imagine that I would have much new to add. But I do think studies like this, regardless of whether each individual kind of data point um, is disputed or not, I think it does speak to the importance of kind of a nuance in these discussions. Like we shouldn't paint all these extinctions necessarily with the same brush, um, and we definitely need to look at these very fine scale kind of patterns to try and tease out, what were the major factors in these extinctions, and as best we can.
Exactly, yeah. Um, and as far as discourse is concerned, yeah, I have seen a little bit of that on social media. I feel like people like don't read the paper and they see the title. The title is very,
Right,
humans did not wipe out Pleistocene island species, and they're like,
right.
sure. They're like, yeah, right. It's like, and I'm like, well, I mean, you just got to kind of read the paper. Um,
That's true.
yeah, it's just the importance of data. And like we're dealing with so many different regions of the world, so many different species.
Mm-hmm.
And our knowledge of like human, history during this time is changing so much. Um, yeah, like the broad brush approach doesn't work, I think. And as much as it would seem reasonable to just kind of say, well, of course it was humans. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, look what happens today. It's like, well, no, maybe not.
Mm-hmm.
People today aren't the same as they were 40,000 years ago, and we have good evidence as to why that is.
Right.
I think this paper does a brilliant job of laying that out. So yeah, that's that's really all I have to say about that. I mean, in this show, we'll certainly return to Pleistocene extinctions, but today is not that day.
Don't want too much of it, right?
Right, right, because oh boy.
All right then. Um, cool. I guess we can wrap up.
Yeah, sure.
All right. Well, as always, we already gave Henry a shout out in this episode, but of course he is responsible for our theme music, so it's only fair to give him another one. And my friend Alicia is the one who designed the color scheme for my avatar, so of course she gets a mention too. And if you enjoyed the show, you can follow us on Twitter, where we'll post links whenever we release a new episode. But since you're probably watching this on YouTube, you can just follow our channel directly and subscribe, and then you can also be notified directly if we upload new episodes. Um, we always enjoy receiving comments, and so please keep them coming if you got any questions or feedback in general. You can also send them to our email if you don't want to leave comments on YouTube, because I don't blame you. Um, and as always, we will link to references and also other major notable websites that we talked about in this episode in the description. So, yeah, see you there. And as for next time, yes, we are going to go back to Jones' Humanity a Prologue. And what do we have to expect then?
Well, we're going to be looking at urbanization and the
Mm,
rise of agricultural states around the world, and kind of the factors that led to their developments, as well as kind of a global survey of different early urban societies that bleeds a little bit into historical records
mm, mm.
and sort of like the founding histories of various regions of the world. Mesopotamia and Egypt and the Indus Valley and China and Mesoamerica and everything else in between. So
Wow.
it'll be a very fascinating and fun episode for sure, especially for history buffs.
Mm, mm. Cool. Yeah, we're definitely seeing kind of, you know, a lot of our modern societies taking shape. So yeah, that's definitely something to look forward to. Um, all right then. So without further ado, then hope everybody has a great day, and please take care and stay safe.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. Till next time.
Later.